Section 7 of Gray's Anatomy Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information as a volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.L. Cohen. Anatomy of the Human Body Part 4 by Henry Gray. The Spinal Cord Part 3. Fasciculi in the lateral funiculus. 1. Descending fasciculi. A. The lateral cerebrospinal fasciculus. Fasciculus cerebrospinus lateralis, cross-pyramidal tract. Extends throughout the entire length of medulla spinalis and, on transverse section, appears as an oval area in front of the posterior column and medial to the cerebellospinal. Its fibers arise from the cells in the motor area of the cerebral hemisphere of the opposite side. They pass downward, in company with that of the anterior cerebrospinal fasciculus, through the same side of the brain as that from which they originate, but they cross to the opposite side in the medulla oblongata and descend in the lateral funiculus of the medulla spinalis. It is probable that the fibers of the anterior and lateral corticospinal fasciculus are not related in this direct manner with the cells of the anterior column, but terminate by arborizing around the cells at the base of the posterior column and the cells of Clark's column, which in turn link them to the motor cells in the anterior column, usually of several segments of the cord. In consequence of these interposed neurons, the fibers of the cerebrospinal fasciculi correspond not to individual muscles, but to associated groups of muscles. The anterior and lateral cerebrospinal fasciculi constitute the motor fasciculi of the medulla spinalis and have their origins in the motor cells of the cerebral cortex. They descend through the internal capsule of the cerebrum, traverse the cerebral peduncles and pons, and enter the pyramid of the medulla oblongata. In the lower part of the latter, about 2/3 of them cross in the middle line and run downward in the lateral funiculus as the lateral cerebrospinal fasciculus, while the remaining fibers do not cross in the middle line, but are continued into the same side in the medulla spinalis, where they form the anterior cerebrospinal fasciculus. The fibers of the latter, however, cross the midline in the anterior white commissure, and thus all the motor fibers from one side of the brain ultimately reach the opposite side of the medulla spinalis. The proportion of fibers which cross in the medulla oblongata is not a constant one, and thus the anterior and lateral cerebrospinal fasciculi vary inversely in size. Sometimes the former is absent, and in such cases it may be presumed that the decussation in the motor fibers in the medulla oblongata has been complete. The fibers in these two fasciculi do not acquire their medullary sheaths until after birth. In some animals, the motor fibers are situated in the posterior funiculus. B. The rubrospinal fasciculus, Monaco, prepyramidal tract, lies on the ventral aspect of the lateral cerebrospinal fasciculus and, on transverse section, appears at a somewhat triangular area. Its fibers descend from the midbrain, where they have their origin in the red nucleus of the tegmentum of the opposite side. Its terminals and collaterals end either directly or indirectly in relationship with the motor cells of the anterior column. The rubrospinal fasciculus is supposed to be concerned with cerebellar reflexes, since its afferent fibers, which pass through the superior cerebellar peduncle, send many collaterals and terminals to the red nucleus. C. The olivospinal fasciculus, Hellwig, arises in the vicinity of the inferior olivary nucleus in the medulla oblongata and is seen only in the cervical region of the medulla spinalis, where it forms a small triangular area at the periphery, close to the most lateral of the anterior nerve roots. Its exact origin and its mode of ending have not yet been definitely made out. 2. Ascending fasciculi. A. The dorsospinocerebellar fasciculus, Fasciculus cerebellospinalis, direct cerebellar tract of Fleischig, is situated at the periphery of the posterior part of the lateral funiculus, and on transverse section appears as a flattened band reaching as far forward as a line drawn transversely through the central canal. Medially, it is in contact with the lateral cerebrospinal fasciculus, behind with the fasciculus of Lissauer. It begins about the level of the second or third lumbar nerve, and increasing in size as it ascends, passes to the vermis of the cerebellum through the inferior peduncle. Its fibers are generally regarded as being formed by the axons of the cells of the dorsal nucleus, Clark's column. They receive their medullary seeds about the 6th or 7th month of fetal life. Its fibers are supposed to conduct impulses of unconscious muscle sense. The superficial anterior lateral fasciculus, tract of Gowers, consists of 4 fasciculi: the ventral spinocerebellar, the lateral spinothalamic, the spinotectal, and the ventral spinothalamic. B. The ventral spinocerebellar fasciculus, Gowers, skirts the periphery of the lateral funiculus in front of the dorsal spinocerebellar fasciculus. In transverse section, it is shaped somewhat like a comma, the expanded end of which lies in front of the dorsal spinocerebellar fasciculus, while the tail reaches forward into the anterior funiculus. Its fibers come from the same but mostly from the opposite side of the medulla spinalis and cross both in the anterior white commissure and in the gray commissure. They are probably derived from the cells of the dorsal nucleus and from other cells in the posterior column and the intermediate portion of the gray matter. The ventral spinocerebellar fasciculus begins about the level of the 3rd pair of lumbar nerves and can be followed into the medulla oblongata and pons almost to the level of the inferior colliculus, where it crosses over the superior peduncle and then passes backward along its medial border to reach the vermis of the cerebellum. In the pons, it lies along the lateral edge of the lateral lemniscus. Some of its fibers join the dorsospinocerebellar fasciculus at the level of the inferior peduncle and pass with them into the cerebellum. Other fibers are said to continue upward in the dorsolateral part of the tegmentum of the midbrain, probably as far as the thalamus. C. The lateral spinothalamic fasciculus is supposed to come from cells in the dorsal column and the intermediate gray matter whose axons cross in the anterior commissure to the opposite lateral funiculus, where they pass upward on the medial side of the ventral spinocerebellar fasciculus. On reaching the medulla oblongata, they continue into formatio reticularis near the median fillet and probably terminate in the ventrolateral region of the thalamus. It is supposed to conduct impulses of pain and temperature. The lateral and ventral spinothalamic fasciculi are sometimes termed the secondary sensory fasciculus or spinal lemniscus. D. The spinotectal fasciculus is supposed to arise in the dorsal column and terminate in the possibly inferior and superior colliculi. It is situated ventral to the lateral spinothalamic fasciculus, but its fibers are more or less intermingled with it. It is also known as the spino-quadrigeminal system of Mott. In the brainstem, the fibers run lateral from the inferior olive, ventrolateral from the superior olives, then ventromedial from the spinal tract of the trigeminal. The fibers come to lie in the medial portion of the lateral lemniscus. E. The fasciculus of Lissauer is a small strand situated in relation to the tip of the posterior column, close to the entrance of the posterior nerve roots. It consists of fine fibers which do not receive their medullary sheaths until towards the close of fetal life. It is usually regarded as being formed by some of the fibers of the posterior nerve roots, which ascend for a short distance in the tract and then enter the posterior column. But since its fibers are myelinated later than those of the posterior nerve roots and do not undergo degeneration in locomotor ataxia, they are probably intersegmental in character. In addition, the fasciculus or tract of Lissauer contains great numbers of fine, non-medullated fibers derived mostly from the dorsal roots, but partly endogenous in origin. These fibers are intimately related to the substantia gelatinosa, which is probably the terminal nucleus. The non-medullated fibers ascend or descend for short distances not exceeding 1 or 2 segments, but most of them enter the substantia gelatinosa at or near the level of their origin. Ransom suggests that these non-medullated fibers and the substantia gelatinosa are concerned with the reflexes associated with pain impulses. F. The lateral proper fasciculus, fasciculus lateralis proprius, lateral basis bundle, constitutes the remainder of the lateral column and is continuous in front with the anterior proper fasciculus. It consists chiefly of intersegmental fibers which arise from cells in the gray substance and, after a longer or shorter course, re-enter the gray substance and ramify in it. Some of its fibers